sure everybody knows, I mean, I am going to provide video lectures of everything we do in this class, and I'm going to post them to Blackboard so that if, for example, something like this happens and, you need to kind of go back over the lectures because we're moving at such a rapid pace, just be prepared, to go to Blackboard. There'll be a YouTube link on there, and that YouTube link will, if you click on that, you'll be able to then watch a replay of the class time that we have together, okay? Let's start with a couple of things here first. I'm going to switch over to the document camera and make sure that you can see this document that I'm working on here. Do you see this thing that I'm looking at? Do you see a piece of paper that says, elements of fiction on the top of it?
Yeah.
Not yet?
Yes, we do.
Okay, you do. Thank you. All right. So here's a couple of things that we need to know. I for some reason, I don't have a view of this from where I am, and so this is something on my end. But I'll get it fixed here in a minute. But I want to talk to you. You should be able to see, elements of fiction and then a bunch of lists underneath there. And I want you guys to, jot these things down because these are key elements that we're going to be kind of the vocabulary of reading analysis. So we need to be able to understand what these principles of fiction are, and that's what we're reading. We're reading short fiction, and that was in chapter 41 for you today. We started talking about the literature and how to read it and what to do. But under the elements of fiction, there's a few things that we need to know. For example, structure, right? How does the plot play out? And as you're going to see in this story, the plot structure is very simple, right? It moves chronologically from a point in time where Mrs. Mallard finds out the news, kind of, goes up into her room, she comes downstairs, and she dies. So the plot structure on this is chronological. There are also, though, as you're going to find out when we read stories like Rose for Emily, you're going to find out that time is being manipulated in these kinds of stories. Well, whenever you see time bouncing around or you see time being manipulated, there's a reason for that. There's meaning behind it. We're going to investigate what that meaning is. So with plot structure, what you have is kind of this literal, chronological point where you have a rising action, and at the pinnacle you have a climax, and then afterwards you have kind of the resolution. So you have rising action, climax, resolution. And in this story, there's very little resolution, right? There's rising action, there's the climax of when she dies, but the resolution is a joy that kills. And it kind of leaves us with this point of, what does that mean? What is a joy that kills? So other things, point of view. What we're able to see here about Mrs. Mallard is not what other people in the world are able to see, right? We are kind of looking at this from an omniscient narrator, someone who's able to look behind closed doors and find out what Mrs. Mallard's doing back there, but we don't really know what's going on inside of her head. So it's a limited omniscience, and that's something that we will be building on over the course of the semester. This whole issue of characterization, right? That's what we're going to be talking about. Why does Mrs. Mallard die? What is Mrs. Mallard thinking? What is she doing? Why does she, performing the actions that she does? That's all building questions about who she is and why she does those things. So that's characterization. Excuse me. Setting and context. We've already talked about this. Late 19th century. Women don't have the right to vote. Women don't have the right to own property, right? This has influence on the story's meaning. I think all of you recognize that and know that. There are also things like literary techniques. We talked last time about metaphor, symbol, right? Heart disease, right? That's a metaphor for, maybe Mrs. Mallard's character. We've also got things like imagery. As you're going to see today, there's, these images of new spring life. Issues like ironing, foreshadowing, and framing. These are all literary techniques. These are things that you can, kind of look at and understand on your own. But ultimately, I want you to know that sometimes we'll be talking about these things to say, hey, look, these are images of new spring life right here in, the story about Mrs. Mallard. And what does that mean? Those images of new spring life are giving Mrs. Mallard hope for something. And then, of course, there's things like title and theme and all those kind of things. What do they mean? In our textbook in chapter 41, they give you a couple of things about how to write about literature. And one of the things they talk about there is writing in the first person. And I want you to disregard that comment, right, from the textbook. We don't want to be writing in first person. What we want to do is take an objective look at things. We want to universalize our conversations about literature. So instead of saying, I think Mrs. Mallard dies of this, I want you to take out the personal pronouns, right? I don't want the I's and the we's in there. I think what you need to talk about is what the author does. So you can just say, Mrs. Mallard dies because of this. You don't have to say, I think Mrs. Mallard dies of this, because it's understood that if your name's on the paper, you're doing the thinking. So we don't need to use those personal pronouns. So as just a brief, catch to what the textbook is telling you, I'm going to tell you do the opposite, right? Don't use the personal pronouns. Just write about what Chopin does as a writer and what the characters do in their actions. And the thing that I do find is relevant in here is writing about it in the present tense. When you write about literature, when you're writing about what your analysis of Mrs. Mallard's actions here, I want you to write about them as if they're happening now, because literature can be picked up 100 years from now, the story can be read, and it'll still say the same thing. So we consider literature to be in a continual present, meaning that we talk about it in the present tense. So when you say that Mrs. Mallard has accomplished some kind of task, you'll say Mrs. Mallard weeps because, not weeped, right? That's past tense. Mrs. Mallard weeps because of her thoughts or whatever. All right. Same thing with authors. When you say that Chopin is trying to accomplish some kind of task, you'll say Chopin demonstrates this by doing something, right? So you're using present tense verbs in order to get this point across. So no first person, universalize your language, and write in the present tense. Those are two good things to attack. Chapter 34 in the textbook, I want you to also understand what this reading, what you had to do as well, talks about organizational structure, and I talked about all those different types of problems with organization. I want to just break it down for you for what my expectations are. I'm not expecting you to get too philosophical about all of this, but ultimately I want the organizational structure to revolve around these things. I want an introduction that establishes that an argument exists, right? So in other words, you've got to establish that there's some background information. You got to look to show that there's two sides to interpreting the story. There's different ways of interpreting the story. So you need to kind of summarize what those two sides are and establishing maybe what happened in the story. So here's Mrs. Mallard. She sees her husband. She dies. And, what does this mean? Well, it could mean this. It could mean that. And then that gives you the perfect lead-in for your thesis, which is to establish that either Mrs. Mallard dies because she's a victim of a repressive husband and the social constrictions of the 19th century, or she's an evil, conniving person. That by doing that, it'll set you up for your body paragraphs, and this is what basic argumentation should do, folks. Right? When you're arguing something, you want to be able to write about what you're trying to interpret the story as. In other words, you're trying to support your thesis, but you also need to show what the other side is doing too, and to really attack that argument, to show that that argument doesn't have as much weight or as much value, or maybe that there's flaws to it. You obviously want to say that, look, the argument has merit. That's the reason why other people are interpreting the story this way. You don't want to say that there's no such thing as an opposing argument, but you essentially want to say that, look, there's another argument out there, but here's why my argument is stronger. All right. So when I talk about those body paragraphs, we talked about the organizational structure the other day. Yes, I said there's evidence paragraphs. You need to support your thesis, but you also need to look at the opposing argument and provide a way to refute that argument. Then obviously your conclusion, which is, look, the other side has merit, but ultimately you need to support your thesis. Okay? So that's how the essay should play out. So when you think about that, when you're getting evidence together for your side of the argument and you're looking at the opposing argument, squeezing all of this into 2 to 3 pages is going to be pretty tough. I mean, you're going to have to start boiling some things down, getting to the main parts, the major parts of what you want to argue. All right. Those are, in a nutshell, are the things I wanted you to get out of chapters 41 and 34. Those were, for the readings today. Now I want to move into the story. But before I get into the story and we finish up this conversation, I just want to make sure I ask the question. Is there anybody who's got any questions or confusion about these elements of fiction and what the organizational structure for the paper should be? You've all read the assignment sheet too, right? You've seen this thing, right? Okay. Any questions, any comments before I move forward and start talking about the story? Okay, good. All right, so let's look at the story of an hour. Now, look, last time we talked, we made very specific points that demonstrated that Mrs. Mallard could be a victim of 19th century social constrictions, right? That this is the way women had to think and feel. It's the way they were forced to live because of a repressive societal structure, right? That men dominated, women were second-class citizens, they didn't have the right to vote, they didn't have the right to own property, so they were restricted in a lot of ways. It comes down to a question then as to how does that social structure influence the marital system, right? And for women to have a place in society, they needed to be married, right? Because they needed to attach themselves to someone who had dominance and control. So that makes sense to you, right? We understand that Mrs. Mallard could be a victim of those circumstances. And Chopin makes this point right here in the probably about the 6th or 7th paragraph down, when she writes that she was young with a fair, calm face whose lines bespoke repression. There it is, right? So you see there in paragraph 7, she's talking about repression and then a certain strength. So you get the feeling that Mrs. Mallard, she isn't just a weakling, right? That she is a person with some kind of strength of character. But as I say that, right, now I want to kind of shift gears and I want to look at this in a different way. I think I could look at Mrs. Mallard as being a strong character who's just been, beaten down by social constrictions. But I also want you to say or understand that there's going to be people who are going to look at this as Mrs. Mallard being a weak character who just couldn't be happy in life no matter what kind of circumstances she was living in, right? So we know that Mrs. Mallard was afflicted with heart trouble, right? And it was, look at how they respond to her. The people deliver the news to her, with care because they're afraid that she might be too fragile. That, to me, sends messages of Mrs. Mallard being weak, right? I mean, you look at this like she couldn't handle that kind of news. Well, that kind of news, really, I mean, this is where things start to come off the tracks for Mrs. Mallard. I think of her as a weak character, but now I'm starting to think of her, when I get to paragraph 3, right? When I get to paragraph 3, if you've got the story, you can look at paragraph 3 with me, right? I think this is a key moment in the story when things start to change. When all of a sudden, as I'm reading this, I start to think to myself, she may not be this victim that I think she is. And here, let me just tell you what it says. It says, she did not hear the story as many women have heard the same, with a paralyzed inability to accept its significance. All right, what does that mean? It means that if any other woman hears that, she's probably going to just be stunned, right? So she's just going to sit there in disbelief. Paralyzed inability to accept its significance. That's what that means. Everybody with me on that? But look at what Mrs. Mallard does. She wept at once with a sudden wild abandonment in her sister's arms. What does that tell you about Mrs. Mallard? How might you interpret that? If she doesn't react the way that other women do, could that mean that maybe she was kind of rehearsing this, that she was planning this, that she knows what societal expectations are, that women should react like this, when they hear this kind of bad news? I mean, there's a possibility that that exists, right? Am I crazy when I say that? When you read that, right, you have to be thinking to yourself that, this doesn't make sense. Why would she have that kind of response? And that's why, I'm now onto a trail to think Mrs. Mallard is a problem. So we get into this next paragraph, and here's this woman who just found out that her husband died, right? Now you're thinking to yourself, if she's married, and look, I get the social restrictions and all, but if she's married and she's been with this guy, for any amount of time, she just found out that he's dead. She goes upstairs and look at the images here. There's our key term, right? One of our elements of fiction. Look at the images here that she experiences. There stood, facing the open window. The image of the open window. In literature, what does that usually mean? The window of opportunity, right? That things are available to her now. If it was a closed window, if it was a dark room, if the doors were closed, then she would be trapped, right? Restricted. But I'm seeing this now as being this window of opportunity, and I'm thinking to myself, why would she be thinking about opportunity when she just found out that her husband is dead? So look at what happens now, right? She starts seeing a comfortable, roomy chair. She's looking at in paragraph 5, the tops of trees, the delicious breath of rain, new spring life, right? A peddler was crying his wares, sparrows are out there. What does that tell you? It's almost like there's a regeneration, there's a rebirth. Mrs. Mallard just found out 5 seconds ago that her husband died. She's upstairs in a room and she's thinking about images of opportunity and rebirth. I don't know if I like that. I mean, being a person who's married, right? I don't know if I would like the fact that my wife would have this celebration at the news of my death. Right? So I'm finding this, her response, to be somewhat different. Do you agree with me on this? Does anybody not see what I'm talking about?
I can hear you very, we're coming in a little pixelated in the audio.
Yep, I just lost you.
Hello?
Yep, you got me?
Oh, we can hear you, but we can't see you.
Yeah, I'm having the same problem. I can't see you either. We'll give it a second here. It kind of started out this way. Our IT guy is out on a call and couldn't get here, so I don't know what's happening. But let me just keep pressing. There you are. I'm having the same problem with pixelization stuff. I mean, if I pixelate, does the volume stop?
Yeah, it's choppy. It comes in and out, and the picture is a little hard to see. But we're here.
Okay.
For pet loss.
Okay. I mean, if you can't hear me, yeah, I know we're going in and out. But if you can't hear me, then at least maybe Ms. Warrell, maybe you could just raise your hand or tell me to wave to me or something and tell me to repeat what I was just saying.
Okay. We're gonna go forward.
Did you get any of that? Did you get any of the lecture that we were just?
It was coming in and out. I think you got the gist, right? The characterization of Mrs. Mallard, she could be contextualized as a weak person depending on where you view her in society.
Right.
Okay.
Good. Okay. All right. So now, all right. So if you understand that, then here's some other things to think about too. Let's look at some of the other evidence in the story. If you're arguing that Mrs. Mallard is a victim of her circumstances, obviously you want to be bringing out words like, the passages about repression. You want to talk about, those 19th century standards for women and those kind of things, which, great. I think that all helps your argument. But what you also have to look at are the other issues that are showing up in the story, right? When she reacts that way, when she finds out her husband is dead, that to me sounds like someone who has been waiting for an opportunity, someone who is being opportunistic here, someone who might not be so committed to her marriage, even though she says that she is, or maybe she doesn't. I don't know, because I don't know anything about her. But what I do know is when I get down here to the bottom of the page, this is where things start to really get interesting for me. I'll let this camera come back on. But with the bottom of the page, she says, or Chopin writes, there was something coming to her, and then when I say bottom of the page, this is paragraph 6, 7, 8, 9. Paragraph 9 says, there was something coming to her, and she was waiting for it fearfully. If she's been planning this, if she's been waiting for this, if this is her opportunity, if this is freedom, why is she afraid of it? Can you give me any explanation for that? Anybody?
Maybe she told how it's gonna feel when she goes through with it.
So there's uncertainty. Is that she's afraid of the uncertainty of it?
Yeah.
Anybody else?
She might feel guilty about like what she's feeling.
Yeah, and that's all right. There you go. So there's the two ways of looking at it, right? So if you're going to argue that Mrs. Mallard is a victim, right, you're going to argue that look, she's fearful because this is uncharted territory for her. She doesn't know what the future will bring. She just knows that there's going to be a different future for her. And the other side of it is if she's waiting for it fearfully, then what is that thing coming for her, right? It could be guilt, right? She could just be feeling that, this isn't right. The feelings that I'm having aren't right. And I know they're not right, but it's my freedom. And I'm going to keep pressing on, right? And that's what it says, right? It says that there was, what was it that was coming after her? She didn't know, right? It was too elusive, but it just kept creeping out of the sky like it was coming to get her. And look at, she does here in paragraph 10, right? She was striving to beat it back with her will, as powerless as her two slight, slender hands would have been. So you can see this image of like this little feeble hands trying to fight off this thing that's coming for her, right? And it gives you the image that she may not be as strong of a character as we'd like her to be, but you can play with that in either side of the argument. You can make her strong, you can make her weak with that, with all those images. So then she begins to mouth the words free, 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 right? And then when we talk about these terms, right? And you see what happens in the story. It says she did not stop to ask if it were a monstrous joy. A monstrous joy. I like joy. Well, how can joy be monstrous? Right? And I think we find out at the end of the story, it's a joy that kills. And that doesn't make any sense to me. I don't even know how joy could be killing us other than the fact that, all right, maybe she was overwhelmed with emotion, overwhelmed with guilt, but we'll find that out. My point of telling you about this, is that you need to connect ideas together. When you see the word joy show up twice in a story like this, and they're described in different ways, you need to be putting those two things together and try to figure out why is the author doing something like that. So when I get to paragraph 12, right, this is the one that is, or 13, right, here's what we find to be a little bit disturbing about Mrs. Mallard, right? She knew that she would weep again when she saw the kind, tender hands folded in death. So now she's thinking about her husband's funeral. She's thinking about what she's going to do. She's going to cry at that funeral, right? He's laying there in the casket with his hands folded on his chest, right? And then she says, the face that had never looked save with love upon her. This poses a problem, right? Because Mrs. Mallard is celebrating her husband's death. And if they lived in a loveless marriage, okay, I can understand that. But she's saying right here that he never looked at her except with love in his eyes. This tells me now that the problem is not her husband, right? I mean, he loved her. That's what Chopin is saying here. She didn't love him. And that, to me, right, is admitted to her, or is admitted right at paragraph 15, when Chopin says, and yet she had loved him sometimes, often she had not. So now we're starting to see a little bit clearer picture here that it may not necessarily be social constriction, other than the fact that Mrs. Mallard, she's married, she doesn't like this marriage that she's in, but her husband is not in the same position that she is, right? Her husband doesn't have the same feelings that she does. I think I would be a little bit more forgiving of Mrs. Mallard if they were in that kind of relationship where they didn't love each other. But the fact that his name is Brentley Mallard, right? He marries for life. She doesn't. She's not committed to the relationship. He is. And this is something that's often overlooked in this story, because this story is often, held up as one of the, kind of, here's a heroine from the 19th century who's willing to kind of, challenge the social constrictions of the 19th century. And when you look at this isn't really an accurate portrayal of someone who's challenging it. It's a portrayal of someone who's just not committed to a relationship. Sure, you can interpret some of those things that way, but there's other ways to interpret them as well. Here's another thing that I want to bring up to you that I think is really significant. Back up a paragraph onto paragraph 14, right? And we talk about these issues of repression, and we talk about how people do things to other people and make, and when you're having, relationships like this, that certain, challenges occur. But look what she says here in this paragraph of 14. She said, there would be no one to live for in those coming years. She would live for herself, right? She talks about that absolutely in the paragraph before. And so now we're getting this image that, yeah, she's breaking free. But when I hear that she wants to live for herself, I'm almost getting the feeling that this is a very selfish woman. Right? She doesn't want to be married, but yet she chose marriage for what? Just to play by the rules of everybody else? If she were a really strong woman, she would have probably not gotten married. But no, she chose to play the game, and now here she is, celebrating this guy's death. And I know this isn't a very popular perspective on this, but look, you can't deny this language in here. And let me tell you why this is so important. Look at the next line. It says, there would be no powerful will bending her in that blind persistence with which men and women, right? Notice what Chopin is doing here. She's saying that we both do it. She's not saying that men do it. And that's what would make sense. If we're talking about this as a story of 19th century social constrictions, we're saying then that the men would be doing this to women. Because it's a patriarchal society, men control, women are servants. That's what it would be saying, but it doesn't say that. What Chopin says is the problem is with the relationship, because she says that both men and women believe that they have a right to impose a private will upon a fellow creature. So she looks at it, Chopin is looking at this as that, yes, both men and women can be guilty of doing this. When you're looking at this evidence, folks, right, it becomes difficult to argue that Mrs. Mallard is a victim of her circumstances. Chopin seems to be giving us evidence here that Mrs. Mallard may be up to something. Mrs. Mallard may be not so much a victim that we think she is. That she may be, kind of a conniving person. She may be just trying to play out society's rules for her own benefit. Let me get married to this guy to give me some social standing, and let's hope he dies so that I can, inherit as well? That seems to me to be a little concerning. So here she goes to the rest of the story, drinking in the elixir of life. She's the goddess of victory descending the stairs. And then when Brentley Mallard walks through the door, right, she dies, right? She's laying there on the floor. And the last line of the story, which I find to be so significant, which, as I said, with joy, right, you look at monstrous joy here in paragraph 12, and you look at joy that kills at the end of the story. You have to compare those things. You look at heart trouble at the beginning of the story, and you look at heart disease at the end of the story, and now you've got two different things at work here, right? Heart trouble tells me that she has a medical condition. Heart disease tells me that she is not a trustworthy person, that she has a diseased heart. She does not have the capabilities of loving. She does not have the capabilities of being in a relationship, that she's got her own agenda, she's got her own purpose, and that she's trying to accomplish whatever is best for her. Now look, you can take whatever side you want on this. I'm not trying to convince you one side or the other. I think both of the arguments can be made very well and very easily. What you can't do is ignore the evidence, right? So when you ask this question about why Mrs. Mallard dies, right, we can come up with two very different responses to that. But one of the things that I come back to is that if Chopin had an intention of any kind, what was she trying to do in this story? I could write this story. If I wanted to write a story where I showed a woman being victimized by social constrictions, I don't think I would put all this stuff in there. So why is Chopin writing this story? If you think about that title, A Story of an Hour, what does that, why choose that? Why isn't it Mrs. Mallard? Or why isn't Mrs. Mallard the victim of, her circumstance? Or why isn't it the glorious Mrs. Mallard or something? Why is it the story of an hour? Any ideas? Yeah, go ahead.
Because it happened in a short period of time.
Yeah, it happened in a short period of time, but what would a short period of time mean? Why would we only need an hour of time to think about this? Is it an hour of, she gets an hour of freedom in her life and that's what she would rather have, is 1 hour of freedom and then she dies? Any thoughts on this? Why the story of an hour? I mean, I'm asking you because I don't know. I don't even really have any perspective on this. I'll tell you this. I keep coming back to, when I read this story, is to what the ultimate purpose is for writing something like this, because it does not seem to me that Chopin has an agenda of any kind to show that Mrs. Mallard is a victim of these circumstances that she writes about. Sure, that's a player in the game, but there's these other factors in there that show that Mrs. Mallard may not be the person that we think she is. So why would Chopin do that? Well, I think it comes down to this. I think she does it because, and this is irrelevant to what you're going to write about, but it's certainly, probably for our own, so when we think about this story, we kind of, have some common sense to associate with it. And I think that what Chopin is doing is she's showing that when we read stories, right, we tend to interpret things according to our perspective, right? I'm reading this story, and I think I'm reading this story, a whole lot differently today as an older married adult than I would have when I was 18 or 20 years old. I would have easily thought of Mrs. Mallard, being a repressed housewife then, but now looking at it from this perspective, I don't have much sympathy for Mrs. Mallard at all. So I'm thinking that what Chopin is doing is she's playing on the fact that, look, we bring baggage into the story, right? When we read stories, we have to understand that our perspectives are skewed by the backgrounds that we have, right? When we come in to read literature, we think about the events and we gravitate toward those things that fit our thinking. And I think this is what she's trying to do. She's trying to show us that, look, there's no right or wrong answer here. There's no easy interpretation of this. What she's trying to do is show that there is a way to think about this from multiple perspectives. And that's what I think makes the story great, right? Because she's well aware of the problems going on. Chopin was an advocate for women's rights. She wrote, stories about women who would rather commit suicide than live in a loveless marriage and those kind of things. So the fact that I know Chopin's background makes this story even more unique, because I think what she's able to do here is she's able to show that, look, it doesn't always appear to be so clear, that the evidence here can be looked at in a variety of different ways. So that's the reason why you're writing this paper, right? You're looking at the evidence, you're looking at the various interpretations here, and we're going to try to argue it out. What's my position? What do I think? And look, there's no right or wrong answer. I don't care which side you take on this. I find that both of these arguments are solid. They both have weaknesses too. But at the same time, you need to understand that as you're writing about this, right? You need to be putting together your argument. You need to be thinking about, where are my weaknesses as I'm talking about this? What is the evidence that's going to contradict this? I want you to focus on what the evidence that's provided for you. When you're writing this paper, focus on the story. Right? You can focus on the setting and those kind of things. That requires a little bit of interpretation. But when you make your argument based on the evidence that's in the text. what I would suggest, I'm suggesting that you do, because the paper's not due for a while yet, what you should probably start doing is kind of piecing together an outline, right? While you've got time this weekend, and I'm sure you're kind of sitting around with, nothing better to do in your time, right? You can start piecing together an outline to show, what are the body paragraphs of evidence I'm going to use to support my argument? What are the evidence paragraphs? What do I need in order to show that there's an opposing viewpoint? Start to piece together that outline so that when we start moving forward, right, you know where you're going when you're writing this paper. All right, I know we're out of time, right, Ms. Warren? I'm close.
Yeah, there's about a minute left.
Yeah, okay. Any questions, any last minute things you want to say or do before we adjourn for the weekend? I know that, this was a little problematic today. Yeah, go ahead. Yep, if I didn't comment on your paper, no big deal. All I did is I sent some of you emails back saying, hey, you need to work on some of these things if I saw real problems in there. You're Shay, right? I sent you an email back. I'm sure I did. If you didn't get it, maybe it's lost in the netherworld. But I didn't find, I'll just say this. Those essays that you wrote, they were for my purposes to determine whether you had the skills to be able to compete in this course. And I'd found that there was no one in here who didn't have those, right? I found all the essays to be adequate enough so you can do what I need you to do. Okay? Everybody's got things to work on, but I just need everybody to know that, there's no one in here that can't do the work and can't accomplish the task that we need you to do. Is that assuring? All right, good. All right, have a great weekend, folks. We'll see you on Monday. We'll be right back at this on Monday talking about major grammatical errors.
Thank you so much. You've done very, very important lecture on Monday.
All right, thank you.